He made her swear that if every other door in her life ever slammed shut, this was the one place she was allowed to knock on. A 20-year-old girl, standing alone, dragging a rusted motorcycle chain across the floorboards of a clubhouse packed wall to wall with 300 Hells Angels. Every head in that building turned at once. Every voice died in the same breath. And in the stillness that followed, the only thing anyone could hear was iron scraping against wood. Slow, heavy, and final dot before we ride any further into this one. If you're new here, tap that subscribe button and stay with the story until the last mile. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're tuning in from tonight. I want to see just how far this one travels. On the night Marcus Stone Callahan turned 55, he made himself a private promise. Nothing was ever going to catch him off guard again. 3 decades riding with the Hells Angels had scraped the capacity for shock out of him. He'd witnessed things that would keep an ordinary man awake for the rest of his natural life. He'd lowered brothers into the ground, fought wars no reporter ever wrote a word about, and carried loyalties so deep most outsiders couldn't begin to make sense of them. 4 years he'd claimed that same corner booth at the Iron Horse Tavern on Saturday nights, and every single one had unfolded the exact same way. Loud, familiar, comfortable. Brothers being brothers. That was the night he learned comfortable doesn't last forever. It was late October. One of those Arizona nights where the heat refuses to let go even after the sun's long gone. The lot outside Iron Horse was jammed tighter than it had been in months. Word had traveled that Rattlesnake Pete was riding in from the Nevada chapter, a rare enough sighting that members poured in from 3 states just to catch it. Inside, the place was elbow to elbow, leather brushing leather, thick with the smell of motor oil, cigarette smoke, and cold beer. Someone had cranked the jukebox loud enough to rattle your ribs. Clusters of 6, 8, 10 men stood trading stories, and out of the far corner rolled that deep, unguarded laughter that only comes from people who've survived something together. Marcus wasn't laughing. He was watching. That had always been his job, and he'd made peace with it long ago. Where others talked, he listened. Where others drank, he counted the room. It was the reason the chapter had put him in the president's chair 12 years back, and the reason nobody had ever bothered contesting it since. He sat with his back to the wall, an untouched beer sweating in front of him, letting the noise wash around him the way a river bends around a boulder that's been sitting in the same spot for decades. Hector Hatchett. Rage dropped into the seat across from him, the signal Marcus had been waiting on all night. Hector was his sergeant-at-arms, a compact, coiled man in his late 40s, known for precision and a bone-deep allergy to wasted words. "Pete's in good spirits tonight," Hector said. "Pete's always in good spirits. Until he isn't," Marcus answered. "Where do we stand with Tucson? The warehouse thing's put to bed. Our people reached terms. Terms that'll hold. They'll hold," Hector confirmed. Marcus nodded, took a slow pull from his beer, and set it back down. "Good. That's been sitting heavy on us too long. My thinking exactly." The jukebox rolled into another track. A cheer erupted near the pool tables. The room felt exactly how Marcus liked it, full of noise, full of people who genuinely mattered to one another. The kind of chaos that reminded him why he'd chosen this road in the first place. Then the front door swung open. He didn't hear it. There was no way to hear anything over the music and the shouting. But Marcus felt the room shift before his eyes ever found the reason. The way 30 years of reading crowds lets a man sense a change in pressure before he can name it. Something snagged at his attention, hook catching cloth. He lifted his eyes from his beer. She was standing in the doorway. The first thing that registered was her age. Young enough that she looked almost breakable inside those walls, which was saying something, because nothing in Iron Horse ever looked breakable. 20, if you were being generous. Blonde hair tangled and sun-bleached from hours on the road, dusted with dessert grit. Plain jeans, a grey shirt, boots that had clearly logged some hard, recent miles. Her eyes swept the room with a specific kind of alertness Marcus recognized from his own first year in the club. the look of someone trying to appear calm, while every nerve in her body screamed at her to bolt. The men closest to the door noticed her first. Conversation near the entrance thinned, then died. And that's when someone spotted what she was hauling behind her. Marcus heard the silence arrive before he actually saw its cause. Laughter cut off first, then talk, and quiet rolled backward through the bar like a tide pulling away from shore, radiating out from the doorway in every direction. The jukebox kept spinning, because nobody had thought to kill it, but within 15 seconds, it was the only voice left in the building. 300 faces, weathered by decades of hard living, all turned toward one 20-year-old woman. She was dragging something. A chain, a thick, old motorcycle security chain, the kind riders used before electronic locks existed. Iron links gone dark with age. It scraped the wooden floor with every step, a slow metallic drag that, in that dead silence, sounded louder than a gunshot. Gripped in her left fist near the top, it trailed behind her, and at the far end of it dragged something else, a vest, a worn black leather cut, holed across the floorboards the way you drag a flag torn down from its pole, and stitched across it, visible from 20 feet, because the patches had been sewn with obvious care and kept up with reverence, were markings every man in that bar knew on sight. An original Hell's Angels cut, old school style, the kind worn a decade or more back, and centered above the patches, above the chapter mark, sat a name tag. Marcus was on his feet before his mind caught up with his body. Hector rose too, but Marcus crossed the room first, cutting a straight line through a crowd that parted without anyone having to ask. He needed to read that name, needed to see it up close, because something in his gut had already whispered the answer, and he needed to know if his gut was right, or if 30 years had finally started playing tricks on him. He stopped 3 feet from her. She lifted her eyes to his, and for a beat neither of them moved. Up close she looked even younger, and the exhaustion carved into her face wasn't the fatigue of a long drive. It ran deeper, the kind that builds slowly over years, the weariness of someone who's been shouldering something heavy with nobody around to help her carry it. Marcus looked down at the vest's name patch. It read, Ghost, Ethan Walker, Ghost. What left Marcus's throat wasn't quite a word. It was something older than language, something that had been sitting like a stone at the bottom of his chest for 5 years. Hector, now beside him, went utterly rigid. The girl studied Marcus's face and said quietly, You knew him. Not a question. Yeah, Marcus said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. I knew him. My name's Emily Walker. The room, already dead silent, somehow found a deeper silence still. Ethan Walker was my father. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then at the chain in her fist, then the vest crumpled on the floor, then back to her face. And there he found Ethan, not in any obvious way, not something you'd catch across a crowded room, but up close it was unmistakable. The set of her jaw, the unflinching directness in her stare, that particular stillness she carried even in a moment of clear terror, a stillness that read as calm when it was anything but. He told me, Emily said, that if I ever had nowhere left to turn, I should bring this here. Marcus let out a slow breath. He turned to Hector. Clear the back room. Hector was already moving. Marcus looked at Emily. Come with me. She didn't hesitate. She scooped up the chain and vest, hugging them to her chest, and followed him through a crowd that parted in dead silence to let them pass. The back room at Iron Horse was reserved for the club's serious business, a bare table, a handful of chairs, one hanging bulb, walls that had absorbed more confessions than most courtrooms. Marcus sat and waited until Emily settled across from him before speaking. She laid the chain and vest on the table between them. How old were you when he died? Marcus asked. 15. And your mother? Something flickered behind her eyes. She was already gone. 8 months before him. Marcus did the math without meaning to. 15 when her mother died. 15 when her father followed. Both losses inside the same year. And now she was 20, which meant she'd spent 5 years navigating the world completely alone. Where have you been all this time? Everywhere. Nowhere long enough to count. working. Whatever I could get. Waitressing, mostly. A stretch in a warehouse last winter. Rented a room above a laundromat in Flagstaff for a while. Why didn't you come here sooner? The question came out heavier than Marcus intended, and he heard the accusation buried in it, one he hadn't meant to aim at her, but was really aiming somewhere else entirely. She heard the weight too, because he told me this was the last resort. He was specific about that. He said, if there's any other road, take it. If there's another choice, make it. Only bring the chain when there's nothing left. And there's nothing left. There's nothing left, she confirmed. The flatness in her voice wasn't defeat. That surprised him. He'd expected the sound of someone who'd broken. What he heard instead was the sound of someone who'd finished a calculation. She hadn't collapsed here. She'd worked the numbers, exhausted every avenue, and arrived at a conclusion with cold precision. Ethan's daughter. Without question, Marcus leaned back. Tell me what happened. Emily folded her hands on the table. Didn't glance down at them once. Another detail Marcus filed away. She held his eyes the entire time she talked. My father ran a small engine repair shop. She began. Built it up over about 8 years. One customer at a time. Nothing huge, but it was clean. And it was his. He owned the building, the equipment, kept a handful of employees who'd been with him 4 years. When he got sick, he arranged for everything to pass to me once I turned 18. Sick how? A heart condition. It moved faster than anyone predicted. By the time the doctors understood how bad it was, he had maybe 4 months left. She paused. He used every day of it. Put everything in writing. Hired a lawyer. Set up a trust. He knew people would look at how young I was and think that made me easy to take advantage of. But they took from you anyway. They took from me anyway. Her tone stayed level. But something moved behind her eyes. The attorney he hired died 18 months after my dad. Car accident. The case files got handed to some junior associate at the same firm. Someone I'd never even met. Right in the middle of that transition, 2 men showed up claiming they held a debt that gave them a controlling stake in the business. Did they? No. The debt was fabricated. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I was 17, freshly orphaned, and I had no idea what a fake debt claim even looked like, let alone how to fight one. Her jaw tightened briefly. By the time I turned 18 and actually had legal standing, they'd already been running the place for 6 months. The staff was gone. The sign had a new name on it, and the lawyer they hired told me, very politely, that if I pushed back legally, I'd burn through years and money I didn't have. Marcus sat with that a moment. And the letter, the one telling you to come here. Emily reached into her jeans and set a worn, many times folded piece of paper on the table. Its creases soft from handling. She slid it toward him without opening it. He wrote it 3 weeks before he died, she said. Made me promise not to open it until I was truly out of options. I kept that promise 5 years. Marcus unfolded it carefully. He recognized Ethan's handwriting instantly. He'd seen it on clubhouse notes, sympathy cards, and once on a letter Ethan had handed him during the darkest stretch of his own life, just to let him know someone was paying attention. The writing was deliberate, precise, the hand of a man who understood that ink outlasts spoken words. It wasn't a long letter. Marcus read it twice, then set it down and stared at the wall a moment before meeting her eyes again. He says you're the most stubborn person he ever met. For the first time since walking through that door, Emily almost smiled. It vanished fast, but it was real. He said that a lot. He also says you fight harder angry than scared. Also true. Are you angry right now? She looked at him head on. I've been angry for 2 years straight. Marcus lifted the letter and read the final paragraph aloud. Asterisk, if my daughter has found her way to you. It means every other door closed on her. It means she tried every road I taught her to try, and none of them held. It means she's carrying that chain, because she's finally out of strength to carry the weight alone. I'm asking you, brother to brother, as a man who believes in everything we swore to each other, stand beside her the way you'd have stood beside me. She has my stubbornness in her, my patience when she needs it, and my refusal to accept that the wrong people get to win. Help her remember that the quiet that settled over the back room was different from the quiet in the main bar. That silence had been 300 people holding their breath. This was the silence of one man sitting with the weight of something he should have seen coming and hadn't. Marcus refolded the letter along its original lines and set it on the chain. How long ago did you read this? 4 months. It took 4 months to get here. It took 4 months to accept I'd truly run out of options, Emily said. I kept telling myself there was another way. Marcus looked at the chain and vest. He thought about the day they'd buried Ethan Walker, the eulogies, the memorial ride, the name they'd carved into the small wall behind Iron Horse where they honored fallen brothers. He'd stood in that cemetery 5 years ago certain they were doing right by him. Nobody had checked on his daughter. Not once, not in 5 years. Marcus stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Hector and 4 senior members were already gathered on the other side, close enough to know something significant was unfolding. Behind them, the bar had settled into a low murmur. Everyone was waiting. I need everything we can find onto men running a business off stolen paper, work somewhere in the Phoenix area. Marcus told his men who they are, where they came from, who their lawyers are, and exactly how they think this plays out. He paused. Because I'm going to make sure they understand precisely how wrong they are about that. Hector was already pulling out his phone. Marcus turned back to Emily, still seated with her hands folded, watching him. You're staying here tonight, not up for debate. My bag's in my car. We'll get it. He studied her. When's the last time you ate an actual meal? She hesitated, which was itself an answer. Right. He looked back through the door. Someone bring food from the kitchen. Real food. Then, to Emily, your father was one of the finest men I've ever known. I won't pretend we handled things right after he passed. We didn't. That falls on us. He paused. But it's different starting now. Emily glanced at the chain. He used to say the Hells Angels had a reputation that scared most people, but that the reputation and the reality weren't the same thing. She lifted her eyes. He said the reality was that you took care of people who had no one else. He said that was the whole point of it. Marcus sat back down across from her. Yeah, that's the whole point. Outside, Iron Horse had come back to life, but it wasn't the same room it had been an hour earlier. The conversations that resumed weren't the same conversations. Word moved through the bar the way it always moved through a room full of men who trusted one another, not as gossip, but as fact passed hand to hand with real weight behind it. Ghost's daughter is here. Ghost's daughter came home. Nobody had to tell anyone how to feel about that. Marcus looked across the table at Emily Walker, at the chain her father had left behind, at the vest that had just dragged 30 years of memory across his floor, and understood something that should have been obvious 5 years earlier. Ethan hadn't just left behind a carved name on a wall. He'd left behind a person, and that person was sitting right in front of him. There are men in this building, Marcus said, who'd have died for your father, and he for them. Every one of them is going to want to know who you are and how you got here. He folded his hands. But before any of that, I need the whole story, not the short version. From the very beginning. Emily nodded. She reached out and rested a hand on the chain for a moment. The way you touch something you've carried a long distance and are finally allowed to set down. Then she started talking. And Marcus Stone Callahan, a man who thought he'd seen everything, found himself leaning forward to listen. Emily talked for a long time. Marcus never once cut in. Ethan had once told him the trick to understanding a tangled situation. Let the person finish before you start asking questions, because the questions that feel urgent at the start rarely turn out to be the right ones by the end. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way years ago and never forgot it. So he sat, he listened, and the longer Emily spoke, the heavier the air in that back room grew. She began with her mother, Diana. Diana and Ethan had met in their late 20s at a roadside diner in New Mexico, where she was waiting tables and he'd pulled off the highway for coffee during a long ride. Emily's father had planned on staying 20 minutes, and ended up staying 3 hours. They married 8 months later. Emily arrived 2 years after that. She never had a problem with what he was, Emily said. Some of the other wives, I remember hearing them talk when I was little, all the worrying, the not knowing where their husbands were. My mom wasn't wired that way. She said she knew exactly who she'd married and refused to waste energy fearing the parts she'd already accepted. Your dad used to talk about her like she was the smartest person in any room, Marcus said. She was. Emily said it flatly, as fact rather than sentiment. She was also sick a long time before anyone caught it. By the time doctors figured out what was happening, it had already spread too far. She died 6 months before my dad's own diagnosis. Marcus did the math again. Diana gone. Then Ethan told his heart was already further gone than it should have been. Then 4 months watching him put his affairs in order, while his 15-year-old daughter tried to grasp that she was about to be completely on her own. What were those 4 months like? Emily went quiet, not searching for words, but deciding how honest to be. He wouldn't let me cry in front of him, Marcus frowned. Wouldn't let you. He said crying was for later. Said we had work to do. She glanced at the chain. At the time I hated him for it. I was 15. My father was dying, and he wanted to spend our last months poring over legal paperwork and teaching me how to read a balance sheet. She paused. I understand it now. He was pouring everything he knew how to give into whatever time he had left. Grief would have eaten up space he didn't have. He was protecting you the only way he knew how, Marcus said. Double quotes. Yes. I just didn't understand that yet. After Ethan died, Emily had gone to live with a distant aunt in Tucson. Not unkind, but wholly unprepared for a grieving teenager and making no particular effort to become prepared. She stayed 18 months, finished school, and left 2 weeks after her 18th birthday, heading straight back to Phoenix to find her father's shop. What she found there rerouted the next 2 years of her life entirely. The signs still read Walker's small engine repair, she said. I stood outside it and, for 1 second, actually felt something like relief, like, okay, it's still standing, it survived. Then a man came out and told me was blocking the entrance. One of the 2 men, Marcus said. Dale Pritchard, she said the name, the way you say a word you've held in your mouth too long and grown to despise. He was one of them. The other was his brother-in-law, Raymond Coyle. By the time I showed up they'd already been running the place under that debt claim for about 2.5 years. What did Pritchard say to you? Her jaw tightened. That the business had been legally acquired and that if I had questions, I should direct them to his attorney. Said it like a line he'd rehearsed 100 times and knew worked well at making people disappear. Did it work on you? No, I told him I was Ethan Walker's daughter. That the business had been placed in trust for me, and I wanted to see the paperwork behind that debt claim. He stared at me about 5 seconds, then said, very quietly, that young people who didn't understand the legal system sometimes mistakenly believed they had more claim to things than they actually did. She stopped. Then he walked back inside and shut the door. Something moved through Marcus's chest that wasn't quite anger, but stood close enough to it that the difference barely mattered. What did you do? Stood there a while, Emily admitted. Then I found the nearest library with public computers and started reading everything I could find on debt claims, business trusts, and Arizona estate law. She'd spent 4 months teaching herself the fundamentals of exactly what had been done to her. No law degree, no training, just, as her father's letter had said, the most stubborn person he'd ever known, armed with a library card and 4 months of relentless focus, which can carry a person further than most people would guess. What she uncovered wasn't simple. The debt Pritchard and Coyle used to seize control had been filed against an earlier version of the business, one that predated the trust Ethan had created. His original attorney, the one killed in the crash, had restructured the entity as part of setting up that trust. Whatever debt existed, if it was even real, had been filed against the old structure and shouldn't have transferred to the new one. But the attorney who inherited the files had either missed that detail or chosen to overlook it. You think the attorney was in on it? Marcus asked, I think the attorney was paid to overlook things, Emily said. I can't prove it, but when I asked that firm to produce the original trust documents, they told me they'd had a records issue and the relevant files were incomplete. A records issue. That's what they said. What did you do with that? I brought what I'd pieced together from public records to 3 separate attorneys. The first said the case was too complex for what I could afford. The second said I might have something, but it would take years. The third told me Pritchard and Coyle had a pattern. They'd already beaten 3 previous challenges in court. The room went very quiet. 3 previous challenges. Marcus repeated. 3. Emily confirmed. Different businesses, different owners. Always small operations where the owner had died or become incapacitated, leaving behind people without the resources for a long fight. She looked at the chain. My father's shop wasn't the first thing they took. It was the 4th. Marcus sat back, feeling the entire situation shift into sharper focus. He'd walked into this room, assuming a family tragedy, a daughter left behind, a business lost to the ordinary cruelty of circumstance. What Emily was describing was something far more calculated. Pritchard and Coyle weren't opportunists who'd stumbled onto a vulnerable situation. They were running a system, hunting down businesses whose owners had died, finding paperwork angles that grieving relatives were too young, too broke, or too overwhelmed to fight, and taking what they wanted. 4 times, at least. And apparently they weren't finished. Is the shop still open? Marcus asked. Still running. New name now. Phoenix Power Equipment. Same address, same building, same equipment my dad bought and maintained for 8 years. Different sign, different owners, and the employees who worked for your father. Something shifted in her expression. That's the part that made me angrier than anything else. He had 4 guys who'd been with him 4 years. Close with all of them, paid them fairly, helped 2 of them through rough patches. Pritchard and Coyle kept to 1 for about a year, then cut them loose. The other 2 were gone within the first month. Did any of them stay in touch with you? 1 did. Carl Briggs, my father's main mechanic, nearly there from the beginning. He's the one who told me the debt claim was filed 6 days after my dad's funeral. She let that hang in the air. 6 days. They had it ready before he was even in the ground. The timing hit Marcus like something physical. 6 days meant preparation had begun before Ethan died. Meant someone had been watching, waiting, tracking things closely enough to have paperwork ready the moment he was buried. Carl told me something else. Emily continued, her voice still controlled, but something harder pressing underneath it. The 2 years of anger she'd mentioned, not hot and loose, but dense, compressed by time into something precise. A week before my dad died, a stranger came into the shop asking questions about the business, ownership, whether Ethan had family. Carl said my father went quiet the second he heard someone had been sniffing around. Told Carl not to answer questions about the business from anyone he didn't know. Marcus went still. Ethan knew. He knew someone was watching, Emily said. Not exactly who, not exactly how, but he knew. That's why the letter was so specific. Why he told me to come here only as an absolute last resort. He didn't want whoever was watching connecting me to the club before I had protection. She paused. He was thinking 3, 4 moves ahead even while he was dying. Marcus looked at the chain. 5 years. That letter had sat folded in her pocket while she walked through every one of them alone, following her father's instructions, even when those instructions meant 1 more motel room, 1 more waitressing shift, 1 more month searching for a road that would hold. There's more, Emily said. He looked up. 6 weeks ago, Carl reached out again. He'd kept his ear to the ground the whole time, stayed connected to people around the shop. He told me Pritchard had started arranging to sell the building, sell the property. The land my father owned outright, Emily said. The building, the ground it sits on. If they sell it, any physical anchor for a legal challenge disappears. Equipment gets moved. Records get restructured. Everything my father built dissolves into a single transaction. And the money goes to 2 men who fabricated a debt and have been running a stolen business for 5 years. When's the sale set to happen? Carl thinks within 90 days. Maybe sooner. She held Marcus's gaze. That's why I'm here now. Not because I finally ran out of strength. Because I ran out of time. The distinction landed with the weight of something entirely true. Marcus rose, walked to the door, and opened it without a word. Hector was still waiting there, along with Danny Vega, and two others Marcus trusted with anything. Inside, Marcus said, "All of you." They filed in and arranged themselves around the small room. Hector studied Emily with the careful, unhurried look of a man who'd learned not to rush his judgments. Danny, younger and less guarded, studied her with open curiosity. "Tell them what you told me," Marcus said to Emily, starting with the debt claim. She did, more concise this time, having already found the shape of her own story. She hit every essential point without editorializing, without reaching for sympathy, laying it out like a stack of facts that needed handling. Marcus watched his men's faces move through the same progression he's had: concentration, understanding, then something harder. When she finished, the room sat in silence. Then Hector said, "Dale Pritchard and Raymond Coyle." "Yes," Emily said. "Phoenix Power Equipment, on Camelback." Her eyes sharpened. "You know them." Hector glanced at Marcus. Something passed between the two men, the kind of wordless exchange that only happens between people who've worked together long enough not to need language. "Why do you recognize that name, Hector?" Marcus asked. Hector pulled out his phone, scrolled, then turned the screen toward Marcus. 3 months back, Tommy Reeves asked us to look into a dispute involving that same address. His cousin had owned a small operation, bought out under pressure, about 2 years before Phoenix Power Equipment ever showed up. The room absorbed that. Emily leaned forward. "What happened to Tommy's cousin?" "Settled out of court," Hector said. "Terms confidential. Walked away with enough to stay quiet, and not quite enough to make reopening it worthwhile." He set the phone down. He always figured something was off, but he didn't have the means to push it. "That makes 5, Emily said, her voice taking on a different weight now, not louder, but denser. 5 businesses, 5 families. Marcus turned to Danny. "I want everything available on Pritchard and Coyle. Business filings, property records, court history, whatever's public, tonight." Danny was already heading for the door. "And find Carl Briggs," Marcus added to Hector. "Emily has his info. I want to speak with him directly." He turned back to Emily, who was watching him with an expression built from too many things at once. Something that might have been relief, though not fully, because 5 years had taught her not to trust relief too quickly. There was assessment, the same calculation that had been in her eyes since she'd walked through the door. And underneath all of that, something quieter, the look of a person who's been alone a very long time, who's just felt the first fraction of weight shift off her own shoulders, and isn't entirely sure yet how to stand differently. "You said 3 previous challenges failed," Marcus said. "What made them fail?" "Resources," Emily said instantly. "Every family who fought did it alone. Private citizens with no money going up against people who had attorneys experienced in exactly this kind of case." She held his eyes. "None of them had anyone in their corner they actually trusted." Marcus nodded slowly. "You said Carl thinks the sale could happen within 90 days. Might. He doesn't have access to the actual transaction details. He's working from what he overhears, so we could have less than 90 days, or more, possibly." Marcus glanced at the vest on the table one last time, then back at her. "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer, all right? Are you willing to stay in Phoenix while this gets sorted? Not vanish, not go back on the road, not decide in a week it's too much and move on." Her expression didn't flicker. "I've been waiting 2 years to stop moving. That's not the same as saying yes." "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Marcus stood and extended his hand across the table, the same way he'd sealed every agreement that had ever truly mattered over 30 years. Emily looked at his hand for one beat. The way someone studies something they've been walking toward a long time and needs a second to confirm is real. Then she reached across the chain, the vest, and the letter carrying her father's last words, and shook it, Outside the back room, Iron Horse had settled into a different rhythm. Not the loud celebration of earlier, but the focused murmur of men working through something together. Word kept spreading. Riders who'd known Ethan Walker before he died were clustering near the bar, trading quiet memories. Rosa, who ran the kitchen, appeared with a plate of food nobody had ordered and set it down in front of Emily without a word before walking back out. A simple, human gesture. Emily stared at the plate a moment, like she'd briefly forgotten this was the kind of thing people did for one another. "Eat," Marcus said. She ate. He sat across from her, letting her eat in silence for a few minutes while he watched the main room through the open door. His thoughts drifted to Ethan, to the last time he'd seen him, about 2 months before he died. Thinner than he should have been, but still moving with that same deliberate energy. Marcus had known that day Ethan was closer to the end than either of them said aloud. He hadn't known what to do with that knowledge, so he'd done what men like him usually did, set it aside and trusted that the right response would show up when it needed to. It had shown up 5 years later, in the form of a 20-year-old woman dragging a chain across his floor. He thought about the 3 businesses before this one, the families left holding something too heavy to grip alone, who'd eventually had no choice but to let go. He thought about Tommy Reeves's cousin, who'd walked away with a confidential settlement and a silence that had probably cost him more than the money ever paid. And then he thought about the fact that Pritchard and Coyle had been running this operation for years, in his city, in his territory, and he hadn't known. That was its own kind of failure, not the dramatic sort, where you make a call you later recognize as wrong. The quieter kind, where you simply never look toward where the problem is forming, where your attention stays fixed on what's directly in front of you, while harm builds at the edges of your vision. You never think to turn toward. Hector came back in as Emily finished eating. "Danny's pulling records," he said. "But I already found something." He set his phone face up on the table. On the screen was a county property record. The building that had been Ethan Walker's shop, the one he'd bought and paid off outright, spent 8 years building something honest inside, was now listed under a purchase agreement executed 3 weeks earlier. The beer was an LLC with a name that meant nothing on the surface, but the registered agent for that LLC was a law firm, the same firm that had inherited Emily's incomplete trust files. Emily stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "They're not just selling it, they're selling it to themselves." The room went dead still. "Through a shell," Hector said. "Through a shell," Emily confirmed. "The money looks like it's leaving, but it stays in the same orbit. They cash out the assets, wipe whatever paper trail ties them to the original theft, and start clean somewhere else." She looked up at Marcus. "This isn't the end of the operation. This is them cleaning house before they run it again." Marcus rose from his chair. Anger didn't show easily on him. People who didn't know him sometimes mistook that for calm. It wasn't calm. It was control, built over decades of understanding that the loudest response was rarely the most effective one. Hector knew the difference and said nothing. Danny, who'd just walked back in on the tail end of it, said nothing either. Marcus looked at Emily Walker, daughter of a man who'd once stood beside him when standing beside him was the harder thing to do, and thought about the letter still sitting on the table, the chain that had dragged across his floor tonight, and the 5 years this girl had spent hunting for a road that would hold. "They've had 5 years," he said. "They don't get 90 days. Emily held his gaze, and for the first time since dragging her father's memory through the door of Iron Horse Tavern, she didn't look like someone bracing for impact. She looked like someone who finally had solid ground behind her. Marcus turned to Hector. "Get everyone we trust in one room by morning. Not a conversation, a plan." Hector nodded once. "And find out who's inside that law firm," Marcus added. "Pritchard and Coyle didn't build this alone. Someone with a license and the case numbers been helping them every step of the way." He picked up Ethan's letter, held it a moment, then folded it and handed it back to Emily. "Keep this. You'll want it later." She took it without asking why. She already understood. Nobody slept much that night. Marcus didn't even try. He sat at the table in the back room after Emily had been settled into the room they kept above the bar for exactly these kinds of situations, where someone needed somewhere safe and the club was the safest place available. He sat with a cold cup of coffee and Ethan's letter in front of him, running back through everything Emily had told him, not hunting for holes in her story, because there weren't any, but trying to map the true shape of what they were up against. Pritchard and Coyle weren't small time. That was the thought he kept circling back to. Small operators made mistakes, got greedy too fast, sloppy too soon, underestimated the people they targeted, until one bad guess cost them everything. But these two had executed 4 clean acquisitions across however many years, survived 3 legal fights without a single loss, and were now in the middle of a shell transaction sophisticated enough that it would take a forensic accountant to catch quickly. That level of operation didn't come from two guys with a scheme and a knack for paperwork. It came from infrastructure. Somebody had built it for them. Hector returned around to in the morning with Danny and a man named Reese, the closest thing the chapter had to a financial specialist, a former bank examiner who'd left that career under circumstances he never discussed and had ridden with the club for 11 years. Reese was quiet, methodical, gifted with the specific talent of glancing at a set of numbers and instantly spotting what wasn't there. Marcus slid the property printout across the table without preamble. Reese studied it for maybe 45 seconds. This LLC was registered 8 months ago, Reese said. Before the sale was even set up. Marcus asked. Before there was any public sign of a sale at all. Reese pulled the paper closer. Registered agent is Whitmore and Associates. Mid-size firm. Mostly commercial real estate work. Been operating in Phoenix about 14 years. Connected to the original debt filing. Reese was already scrolling his phone. Not directly. That was handled by a solo practitioner, Gerald Fenn. He's the one who died in the crash. Files transferred to a junior partner at his old firm, a woman named Carla D'Souza. He paused. Whitmore and Associates hired D'Souza away from that firm about 18 months ago. The room went still in that particular way it does when a coincidence stops looking like one. So D'Souza carried the Walker files over with her when she moved, Danny said. She'd have had access to them, Reese said carefully. Whether she took them is a separate question. She didn't need to take them, Marcus said. She just needed to know what was in them, what the trust looked like, where the weak points were, what the timeline was. He looked at Hector. Find out how long D'Souza's been connected to Pritchard and Coyle. On it. Hector stepped out. Reese kept working. Laptop out now. Running searches with the sharp efficiency of a man who'd spent years getting paid to find exactly this kind of thing and never lost the instinct just because the employer changed. Marcus watched him and thought about the web they were uncovering, how every thread connected to another, how none of it was accidental. There's more, Reese said, not looking up. Tell me, the LLC buying the building. I found a parallel structure registered in Nevada. He turned the laptop so Marcus could see. Same registered agent, similar filing date, different named members, but the capitalization patterns, identical. He tapped a column of figures that meant little to Marcus, visually, but clearly meant plenty to Reese. They're not just doing this in Phoenix, Danny said, leaning over. How many states? I'd need more time to map it fully. But tonight alone, at minimum, 3. Arizona, Nevada. And I'm seeing indicators pointing toward New Mexico. Reese sat back. This isn't a local scheme. It's regional. Marcus was quiet a moment. How many businesses? If the pattern holds across all 3 states, Reese said, meeting his eyes, more than 5. The weight of that number settled in and stayed. Marcus thought about the families, not abstractly, but concretely, the way he thought about anything that demanded action. How many people had sat exactly where Emily had sat, trying to understand why something legally protected had vanished anyway? How many of them hadn't had a father who left behind a chain and an address? How many had simply run out of road with nobody waiting at the end of it? He stood. Get me everything by morning, he told Reese. Every entity, every filing, every name that connects. I'll need until 6 or 7. Then I'll be here at 6 or 7. He walked out through the main bar, nearly empty now. Just a couple of members lingering with drinks they weren't really drinking. The jukebox had finally gone quiet. The lot outside had thinned to maybe 30 bikes, belonging to men who'd decided, without being asked, that they'd be here in the morning. Marcus stood outside a while. He thought about Ethan, about the night he'd been voted into the club, younger then, but already carrying that same quality of deliberate stillness his daughter had inherited. He thought about a night 12 years back, when Ethan had driven 4 hours in the dark, just to sit with Marcus through something Marcus hadn't known how to survive alone, hadn't asked for help, but needed it. And Ethan had somehow known and shown up anyway, sat there the way good men sit with each other when words are the wrong tool, steady, present, asking nothing in return. Marcus had never asked how Ethan knew to come. He just had dot. And now his daughter was asleep upstairs with everything her father had left her folded in the pocket of her jeans. Somewhere out in the city, 2 men were preparing to erase the last physical trace of Ethan Walker's life's work. Marcus went back inside. He wasn't going to sleep. He had things to plan. By 7 the next morning, the back room held 8 people: Marcus, Hector, Danny, Reese, and 4 senior members who'd known Ethan personally and had shown up without needing an explanation, simply because Marcus had asked. That was the kind of men they were. Emily came down at 6:30. She'd slept, though not deeply, and carried the same sharpened alertness Marcus had noticed the night before. She had the chain with her again, not dragging it this time, but looped in her hand, the way you carry something you've decided to stop being weighed down by and start being armed with. She sat, looked around at a room full of strangers, and said simply, "What did you find?" Reese walked her through it, careful, methodical, laying each piece out in order, showing his sources, never overstating what he knew, precise about what was still inference. Emily listened without cutting in, which Marcus noted and appreciated, since most people interrupted Reese within the first 3 minutes, and it slowed everything down. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. The first concerned the timeline of D'Souza's move to Whitmore relative to the Nevada filings. Reese pulled the dates, and they lined up in a way that was damning without quite being conclusive. The second concerned the Shell LLC's capitalization structure. Reese explained. Emily nodded and said, "So the money funding the purchase traces back to the earlier acquisitions?" Reese blinked. "That's what the pattern suggests. Yes, it's a cycle," she said. "Each theft bankrolls the next one. They're not bringing in outside capital. They're using stolen assets as their capital base." "Correct." Her third question surprised the room. "What happened to Gerald Fenn?" The question landed, and then expanded, the way certain questions do. "The original attorney," Reese said, "died in a car accident." "I know," Emily said. "I've known that for years. I never dug into it because I was a teenager with no resources when it happened, and there was nothing I could have done with the answer, even if I'd found it." She looked around the table. "We have resources now. I want to know if that accident was actually an accident." The silence that followed belonged to people who hadn't thought of that, and clearly should have. Marcus glanced at Hector, who was already reaching for his phone. Danny said out loud what several in the room were already thinking. "If it wasn't an accident, this isn't just fraud." "No," Emily agreed, holding his eyes. "And the people we're up against are considerably more dangerous than a pair of opportunists running a debt claim scam." Marcus had dealt with dangerous men before, but the danger Emily was describing belonged to a different category, the kind that wore a suit, worked through attorneys and shell companies, and used the law itself as the primary weapon. Harder to fight than the more direct kind, in some ways, but not impossible. He let the room sit with it 30 seconds before speaking. "Reese, add Fenn's accident to what you're chasing. Everything public, dates, the accident report, whatever's out there." Reese nodded, typing. "Hector, find Carl Briggs today." "Already tried this morning," Hector said. "He's not picking up." Emily's head snapped up. "When did you last talk to him?" 2 weeks ago. He was fine. He's the one who told me about the sale. She went very still, in the way she went still when she was holding something in check. He knew I was coming here. I told him that was the plan. You told him you were coming to Phoenix, Marcus said. I told him I was going to find help. I didn't say where. She looked at him directly. But if they'd been watching me, if they knew my father sent me here, they might have known to watch Carl too. Carl doesn't have anyone, she said. He lives alone. He's been retired 2 years. She set the chain down on the table. The first time she'd let go of it voluntarily since the night before. If something happened to him because he helped me, we don't know that anything happened, Marcus said. Firm, but not sharp. He might have had his phone off, might be out of range. We don't know yet. Then find out fast. There was an edge in her voice that hadn't been there a minute earlier. And Marcus understood it precisely. The specific fear of someone used to absorbing consequences alone, terrified that finally asking for help had widened the blast radius to someone who didn't deserve to be caught in it. Danny, Marcus said. I'll find him myself, Danny said. Already out the door before Marcus finished the sentence. The meeting kept moving, but the current underneath it had shifted. What began as an investigation into what Pritchard and Coyle had done was becoming an investigation into how far their reach extended, to very different questions, carrying to very different sets of consequences. A local fraud operation was one kind of problem. A regional network that might have removed a witness through something dressed up as an accident was something else entirely. Reese pulled the police report on Gerald Fenn's accident within the hour. He read it twice before saying a word, then turned the laptop toward the table. Single vehicle, he said. Went off Route 93 north of Wickenburg at 2 in the morning. No witnesses. Official cause, distracted driving. 44 years old. No prior incidents. No history of trouble behind the wheel. He tapped a section of the report. Investigation was handled by a county deputy, Roystoler. Marcus turned the name over. It meant nothing to him. Yet, Roystoler, Hector said from the corner. Retired from Maricopa County Sheriff's 3 years back. Now does private security consulting. He paused. For Whitmore and Associates. The room went dead silent. Marcus looked at Hector for a long beat. Hector looked back with the flat, careful expression of a man who just confirmed something he'd hoped he wouldn't have to. Emily sat rigidly straight. Let's be exact about what we're seeing, Reese said, choosing every word with care. An attorney died while investigating on behalf of the Walker estate. The deputy who handled that investigation later took a job with the firm now managing the shell sale. There's a pattern of acquisitions across at least 3 states, and there's a potential witness who isn't currently answering his phone. He stopped. Any single piece of that could be coincidence. All of it together isn't. My father knew, Emily said. Every eye turned to her. He knew someone was watching before he died. He knew they were organized enough to have paperwork ready before he was even buried. He built a 5-year waiting period into my instructions specifically, so I wouldn't connect myself to the Hells Angels until I had protection in place. She looked at Marcus. He understood exactly what these people were capable of, well enough to design a protocol to keep me safe. What she left unsaid was clear anyway. My father understood the danger better than I did, and he spent what was left of his life protecting me from it. And I've been walking inside that protection for 5 years without even knowing it. Marcus heard it and didn't say it aloud, because some truths are too large for that kind of sentence. Sometimes the right response is just to let them sit. What we need, Marcus said eventually, is someone inside Whitmore and Associates. Reese shook his head slightly. That's difficult without. Not a plant, Marcus said. Someone who's already uncomfortable. Someone who knows enough to be scared of what she knows. He turned to Hector. D'Souza went from a solo practice to a big commercial firm. Looks like a smart career move on paper, but she's been there 18 months, sitting on files that tie her to a fraud that's starting to look like something worse. He paused. How comfortable do you think Carla D'Souza actually is? The question hung there. Emily was the one who answered. Not comfortable, she said. If she was smart enough to pass the bar, she's smart enough to understand what she's tangled up in. And if she figured out what really happened to Gerald Fenn, she's been carrying that for 18 months. People carrying something, Marcus said, are usually looking for a way to set it down. But they need to believe the alternative is safer than staying quiet, Emily said. Which is where we come in. Something new was building in her expression. Not quite trust, not yet, since real trust takes more time than they'd had. But something adjacent to it. The recognition that the person across from her was thinking in the same direction and had the capacity to get there. I need to be part of the conversation with D'Souza, Emily said. If it happens, that's not the safest choice. I know it's not the safest choice, she said, but I'm the one who can tell her things no one else could verify. I know what was in my father's files. I've spent 2 years piecing them back together. I know what Fenn would have known. If she spends all this time wondering if anyone else has figured it out, I'm the one who can tell her, yes, someone has, and she's not the last person holding this. She held his gaze. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you why it has to be me. The room went quiet for a beat. Your father said you had his stubbornness, Marcus said. He wasn't paying me a compliment when he said it. No, Marcus agreed. But he wasn't wrong either. Danny came back in at 9:30, and the look on his face told Marcus everything before a single word left his mouth. Marcus had known Danny Vega 18 years. He'd seen every variation of that expression in every kind of crisis. This was the one he wore when the news was bad, and he was choosing how to deliver it. The room felt it too. Emily went still. Danny looked at Marcus. Carl Briggs is in the hospital. Phoenix General. Admitted 2 nights ago. He paused. Hit and run. Walking home from the grocery store. Total silence. Emily's hand drifted to the chain without her seeming to notice. How bad? Marcus asked. Broken ribs. Broken arm. Concussion. They're calling him stable. He's awake. He can talk. Will he talk to us? Danny looked at Emily. He asked for her by name. Once I told him who I was and why I was there. He said the only person he wanted to speak with was Emily Walker. Every head turned. Emily was already on her feet, chain in hand, looking at Marcus. I need to go now. Marcus stood. You're not going alone. She didn't argue. She was already halfway to the door. The drive to Phoenix General took 22 minutes. Marcus drove, Emily in the passenger seat, Hector in the back. She didn't talk, and Marcus respected that completely. He understood the weight she was carrying, the specific guilt of knowing a man had been hurt for helping her, and the understanding that guilt wasn't useful right now, but would need somewhere to go eventually. Carl Briggs was on the 3rd floor, smaller than Marcus had pictured from Emily's description, a compact man in his mid-60s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working with his hands. His arms sat in a cast from wrist to elbow, his face carrying the yellow-green bruising of real impact. Monitors beside him tracking his body's slow, steady effort to repair itself. He saw Emily in the doorway and something shifted in his face that had nothing to do with his injuries. Kid, he said, voice rough from whatever they'd given him, warmth threading through the roughness anyway. You made it. Emily crossed the room, dragged a chair to his bedside, and laid her hand over his good one. I made it. Your dad would have. Carl stopped, collected himself. He'd have said something that sounded tough, but meant he was proud. He definitely would have, Emily said. Carl's eyes moved to Marcus, then Hector, with the assessment of a man who'd spent years reading people out of practical necessity. These are the people he told you to find. Not a question. Yes, Emily said. Carl nodded slowly, working through some internal decision. Marcus stayed quiet. This wasn't a moment for pushing. The man had been hit by a car 2 nights ago. He'd earned a beat to gather himself. The night before they hit me, Carl said finally. Someone called my cell. Unknown number. Didn't say much, just that it'd be smart for me to forget about the Walker situation. That some things were better left alone. He paused. I'd been getting calls like that for about 3 weeks. Stopped answering unknown numbers. That last night I picked up anyway, because I figured it might be Emily. Did they say anything specific? Marcus asked. They mentioned Emily by name, said she'd made some unwise choices, reaching out to people she shouldn't, and that anyone helping her was taking on a risk they probably didn't understand. He stopped. 2 hours later, I was flat on the ground in a parking lot, and whoever did it was long gone. Emily's hand tightened over his. They were watching you, Hector said, and they knew Emily had been in contact. Been watching both of us a while, I think, Carl said. After Emily called about the sale, I started noticing things I'd been ignoring before. Somebody drove past my house 4 days running. Figured I was being paranoid. He exhaled carefully, the way a man with broken ribs learns to. Wasn't paranoid, Carl, Emily said, her voice steady, but with something underneath it Marcus could hear. I need to ask you something, and I need the full truth. Go ahead. When Gerald Fenn died, did you know him? Carl was quiet a beat longer than a simple no would have required. Met him twice. He came by the shop about 2 months before your dad died. Asked questions about the business structure, the employees, the ownership history. Your father had hired him specifically to make sure everything about the transfer to you was airtight. He looked at her directly. Careful man. Thorough. Had a legal pad he filled front and back both visits. Told me he was building a record that would hold up against any challenge. And then he died, Emily said. And then he died, Carl confirmed. I thought about it a lot, but I was just a mechanic, a retired one at that. Didn't know what to do with what I was thinking. So I did the only thing I knew how. Stayed close, paid attention. You've been watching this for 5 years, Marcus said. Carl met his eyes. Somebody had to. It wasn't said heroically. It was just true. The truth of a man who'd loved his employer, who knew something was wrong, who'd stayed near the situation, because walking away entirely would have felt like a second betrayal on top of the first. Did Fenn tell you anything specific? Marcus pressed. Anything that stuck with you? Carl thought it over. Said he'd found something in the original business filings that would make any debt claim against the new structure legally indefensible. He was precise about that word. Indefensible. His eyes shifted to Emily. Said whoever came after that business would hit a wall they couldn't get through. And before he could file anything, Emily said. He was dead. Carl finished quietly. Marcus glanced at Hector across the bed. The record, Hector said. Fenn's legal pad. If it still exists, it'd be proof, Reese said from the doorway, having apparently arrived without Marcus noticing. Not just of the fraud, of premeditation. Proof of exactly when they knew what they were dealing with, and what they did about it. Carl reached slowly with his good hand toward the narrow table beside his bed and pulled open the drawer. From the back of it, he withdrew something he'd clearly placed there before any of them arrived, with the deliberate intention of a man who'd known this moment was coming and had prepared for it. It was a photograph. He held it out to Emily. She took it. It showed Gerald Fenn standing at the shop workbench, legal pad open, looking toward the camera, with the mildly distracted expression of someone who hadn't noticed the shot being taken. Beside him on the bench, visible in frame, sat the open business files of Walker's small engine repair, and in the background, slightly blurred, but legible if you looked closely, hung the whiteboard Ethan kept for tracking work orders. Written at the top in Ethan's own hand was a date, 8 days before Fenn's accident, and below the date, 2 words that hadn't meant much to Carl when he'd tucked the photo away, but that now, in this room with everything they'd learned laid out like pieces of a map finally revealing its shape, were the most important 2 words in the entire picture. Asterisk they know. Asterisk. Emily stared at the photograph a long time. Then she looked up at Marcus, her eyes completely clear, completely certain, and said in a voice so quiet and so absolute it carried across the whole room without effort, "My father knew exactly what was coming, and he built us a way to fight it anyway." Marcus took the photograph from her gently, studied it a moment, then looked at Emily Walker, 20 years old, carrying a chain that had traveled 5 years to reach this room, and understood, with a clarity that felt long overdue, that Ethan hadn't simply sent his daughter to them for protection. He'd sent her with everything they needed to finish this. Marcus held onto the photograph the entire drive back from Phoenix General, and when they pulled into the Iron Horse lot, and the others climbed out to start talking through next steps, he sat in the truck an extra minute just looking at it. Ethan's handwriting on that whiteboard. Asterisk, they know asterisk. 2 words written 8 days before a man drove off a dark road and never came back. 2 words that proved Ethan Walker had understood exactly what kind of people were circling his life's work, and had chosen, with full awareness of the cost, to keep building his daughter's protection instead of running. That was Ethan. That had always been Ethan. Marcus got out. The day had turned while they were at the hospital. The morning heat now fully settled in, pressing down the way Arizona heat does in late October when it refuses to acknowledge the calendar. The lot held 15 bikes, everyone belonging to someone who'd decided, without being asked, to stay. Hector fell in beside him. Reese has more. How much more? Enough you're going to want to sit down. Back in the room, Emily took her seat without ceremony. The chain looped over the back of her chair. She'd been quiet on the drive, processing Carl's hospital room, the way Marcus could see her process everything, turning it over, finding its angles, fitting it into the larger structure she was building in her mind. Reese had his laptop open and 3 documents printed and laid across the table. Gerald Fenn, he said without preamble, found his case records through the county probate courts. Before he died, he'd filed a preliminary motion in the Walker estate matter, challenging the legitimacy of the debt claim, the grounds that the restructured business was a separate legal entity from the one the debt had originally been filed against. He looked up. Filed it 6 days before he died. The room absorbed that. So the filing exists, Marcus said. It exists. It's a public court record. Never got acted on because Fenn died before it could be heard. When his files transferred to D'Souza, the motion was listed as pending but never advanced. He lifted one of the printouts. It's been sitting in the probate system for 5 years as an open, unresolved motion. Emily leaned in. Is it still valid? That's the question I spent the last 2 hours answering, Reese said. According to 3 separate legal databases and a retired judge at 7 this morning who owed me a favor, yes, still valid. Never expired because it was never formally withdrawn or ruled on. It's been sitting open the entire time. Marcus looked at Emily. She was completely still. Fenn built us a door, she said quietly. He built you a door, Reese confirmed. And D'Souza, who inherited both the files and access to that motion, either didn't know it existed or knew and chose not to touch it, or was paid not to, Hector said. Or was paid not to, Reese agreed. If we can get into probate court and advance that motion, we reopen the legal fight using a -1-year-old filing that predates every transaction Pritchard and Coyle have executed since, including the sale, meaning the sale can't go through while the motion's active, Emily said, meaning it can't legally close while the motion's active and properly advanced, Reese said. Yes. Marcus looked around at Hector, already calculating, at Danny, back in the room mid-conversation, at the older members along the wall who'd ridden with Ethan, sitting with the specific quality of men who understand that some debts never expire. We need an attorney to advance this, Marcus said. We need a very particular kind of attorney, Emily said. Someone who can't be leaned on. No ties to Whitmore and Associates or anyone connected to them. She looked at Marcus. Do you know someone like that? Marcus thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. I know exactly the person. Her name was Patricia Solano, and she'd represented the chapter in various legal matters for 19 years. Fiercely effective, in the words of the people on her side, and a force of nature in a blazer, in the words of the people who'd faced her across a table. She was 61, had come up in South Phoenix back when South Phoenix didn't produce many attorneys, and carried a particular contempt for people who wielded legal structures as weapons against those who couldn't afford to fight back. It wasn't detached professional distaste. It was personal, rooted in something real, and it had never softened with age, Marcus called her. She picked up on the second ring. which meant she was already at her desk. "I need you today," Marcus said. "You always need me," she said. "What is it?" "A probate motion that's been sitting open 5 years. A fraud operation running across 3 states. Possible witness intimidation. And a woman named Carla D'Souza, who I think is sitting on information that could crack this wide open if the right person asks her the right questions." A pause of about 3 seconds. "I'll be there in an hour." She was there in 45 minutes. Patricia Solano was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair kept short, and reading glasses worn on a chain that only came out when something required precision, which was most things. She came into the back room, shook every hand at the table in a brisk, businesslike way, then sat and looked at Emily. "Your ghost's daughter." Emily blinked. "You knew my father. He consulted me once about his business structure," Patricia said. "About 6 months before he died. Didn't hire me. Said he'd already found an attorney, but wanted a second opinion on the trust." She paused. "I told him the trust was well built, but that restructuring the business entity was the single most important protection he had, and he needed his attorney to document it exhaustively. Do you think Fenn followed that advice?" "I think Gerald Fenn filed a motion that's been sitting in probate court for 5 years proving he did exactly that," Patricia said, and held out her hand toward Reese. "Show me what you have." Reese handed the documents over. She read fast and thorough, glasses on, not saying a word, while she worked. The room stayed quiet. Marcus watched Emily watching Patricia, saw the same careful measuring quality he'd seen when Emily decided whether to trust anyone new. The specific caution of someone who'd once trusted the wrong person and paid for it. Patricia set the documents down, removed her glasses. "The motion's valid. I can advance it. It'll need a filing fee and formal notice to every interested party. Pritchard, Coyle, their attorneys at Whitmore and Associates, and the LLC come partly under the purchase agreement." She looked at Marcus. "They'll know we've found the motion within 24 hours of filing." "How will they respond?" "Urgently," Patricia said. "They'll try to rush the sale closed before the motion can be heard, which means accelerating the closing timeline. They may also try to get the motion dismissed on procedural grounds." She paused. "They won't succeed on procedure if I file this correctly, which I will. The real danger is the acceleration. If that building transfers before we can freeze the transaction, this gets significantly harder." "How fast can you file?" Emily asked. "If I leave this room in the next 2 hours with everything I need, I can file before end of business." "Then let's not waste the 2 hours," Emily said. They worked, not the dramatic kind of work that looks impressive from outside. The meticulous, grinding, essential kind. Reconstructing the chain of custody on the estate files, building the factual record Patricia needed to advance the motion on the strongest possible footing. Emily knew things that existed in no document anywhere. Details Ethan had told her during those 4 months. Pieces Fenn had captured on his legal pad that she'd absorbed at 15 and carried for 5 years, without fully understanding their purpose. She understood now. Every detail she offered, Patricia captured in precise, structured notes. Every connection got documented, attributed, tied down. What emerged wasn't just a fraud case. It was a case with a 5-year paper trail, a dead attorney, a hospitalized witness, a pending shell transaction, and a motion already sitting in the system, a loaded weapon someone had left in a drawer, waiting for the right hand to pick it up. Midway through, Danny stepped in and spoke quietly to Hector. Hector's expression shifted in the way that meant the news mattered. "D'Souza called in sick to Whitmore this morning," Hector said. Work at the table paused. "Interesting timing," Patricia said, not looking up from her notes. "Could mean she knows something's moving," Marcus said. "Or she's been waiting for something to move, and now that it has, she's deciding what to do," Emily said. Marcus looked at her. "You still want to be the one who talks to her?" "I should be the one," Emily said. "She's an attorney who inherited files she probably didn't fully understand at the time, and has since figured out she's sitting in the middle of something that includes fraud at minimum, and possibly a man who died. because he knew too much. She held Marcus's eyes. She doesn't need someone threatening her. She needs someone to sit across from her and tell her the truth about what happens to the people who stay silent versus the people who don't. She paused. I've been silent for 5 years. I know exactly what that costs. Patricia looked up from her notes, studied Emily a long moment, then said to Marcus, "Let her do it." Marcus thought it over, thought about Ethan's letter, the line about stubbornness and patience and the refusal to accept that the wrong people win, thought about the photograph in Carl's hospital drawer, an asterisk, they know asterisk written on a whiteboard in a dead man's handwriting, thought about the courage it took to walk alone into a biker bar at 20, dragging your father's chain across the floor because every other door had shut. "All right," he said. Emily nodded once, then turned to Patricia. "Can you find her address?" "I can find her work address," Patricia said. "I won't hand over a home address. We do this the right way." "Works fine," Emily said. "If she called in sick, she's home, but her work address is where we reach out through proper channels and let her choose." "You're not going to her house," Marcus said. "Not a question. I'm sending her a letter," Emily said. "Through Patricia's office. Formal, professional, on legal letterhead. It'll explain that a motion's been filed, that certain documents have surfaced, and that we'd welcome speaking with her as someone who could provide useful context." She looked at Patricia. "Can you send that?" "I can send that today. Certified mail and email," Emily said. "I want her to know we're operating above board, every step. I want her to understand the people reaching out aren't the kind she needs to fear." Danny, from his spot near the door, said quietly, "She's going to be afraid of Marcus." "She doesn't need to meet Marcus yet," Emily said. Marcus, who found this entirely reasonable, said nothing. Patricia filed the motion at 4:17 that afternoon. Marcus knew the exact time because Hector told him, and because the 14 minutes between Patricia leaving the courthouse and the first call landing on the Iron Horse phone line had the particular quality of quiet that precedes something. The call came from a number registered to Whitmore and Associates. Hector answered, listened about 30 seconds, said I'll pass that along, and hung up. "They want to talk," Hector said, framing it as a misunderstanding they'd like to clear up. "Of course they are," Marcus said. "They specifically asked to speak with whoever represents the Walker estate." "That's Patricia," Emily said. "They specifically asked asterisk, not asterisk, to speak with Patricia Solano," Hector said. "By name." The room absorbed that. "They know who we retained," Marcus said. "They found out within 3 hours of the filing," Reese said, "which means someone's watching the courthouse. Someone inside the county system, either on their payroll or holding enough debt to owe a favor that fast." "How many people are wrapped up in this?" Emily asked. Nobody had a good answer yet. "Enough that we need to watch where we talk and who we talk to," Marcus said. Then turned to Hector. "Nobody outside this room hears about the motion until Patricia confirms it's been properly served, already handled," Hector said. Marcus turned back to the table and found Emily doing the same recalibration he was doing, reassessing the scale of what they were facing. She'd come to Iron Horse, having exhausted every other option, understanding Pritchard and Coyle were sophisticated and connected. She hadn't fully grasped, until this moment, how deep those connections ran, deep enough to have a court filing tracked and reported inside 3 hours. "He knew," she said, looking at Marcus. "Ethan knew it was this big. That's why he made me wait. Stay off the radar, avoid connecting myself to anyone he trusted until I had protection that could actually match what I was walking into." Her voice was controlled. "He was shielding me from something that took 5 years for me to fully see. And now you see it," Marcus said. "Now I see all of it." There was a knock. Rosa, from the kitchen, arrived with a food tray nobody had ordered and set it on the edge of the table, the way she set everything down. Efficient, wordless. But she paused before leaving, unusual for Rosa, who never paused. She looked at Emily. "My husband was a member. Before he passed, he knew your father." She held Emily's eyes a moment. He used to say Ghost was the kind of man who made everyone around him better, just by being in the room. She stopped. Thought you should know someone said that about him. Emily held her gaze. Thank you. Rosa nodded once and left. The room settled into that recurring quality. The weight of what they were doing pressing against the weight of why they were doing it. The two forces combining into something that felt like pressure and purpose at once. Marcus took a piece of food off the tray and ate standing, his body finally registering it had run on coffee and adrenaline for 12 straight hours. Around the table, others did the same. Emily didn't eat. She was looking at the chain. What are you thinking? Marcus asked. She looked up. About the other 4 families, the other businesses, the other people who tried fighting this and ran out of resources. She rested a hand on the chain. When we advance this motion, is there any chance of reaching back to those cases? Patricia, back from the courthouse and seated at the end of the table, said, if we can establish the fraudulent pattern as part of this case, yes. Each earlier case could potentially reopen, depending on statute of limitations and the specifics. She paused. It's ambitious. Is it possible? It's possible, Patricia said carefully. It would need considerably more time and resources than the immediate matter, but possible. Emily nodded. Not a decision spoken aloud, just filed away, marked as something she intended to return to. Marcus could see the process play out in her face, the organized, deliberate quality of someone who managed complicated situations by separating the immediate from the eventual and addressing each in the right order. Ethan had been exactly the same way. The certified letter to Carla D'Souza went out at 5 that evening. Patricia's paralegal sent a matching email to the address on file at Whitmore & Associates. Emily and Patricia had drafted it together, working through 4 revisions until it said exactly what needed saying. Nothing threatening, nothing implied, nothing that could read as improper pressure on a potential witness. It stated a motion had been filed in the Walker estate matter. It stated certain documentation had come to light regarding the case's history. It stated they'd welcome hearing from anyone who could offer context on the transfer of files from Gerald Fenn's estate to the current firm. And in the closing paragraph, it acknowledged this was a sensitive matter and assured that anyone stepping forward in good faith would be properly protected. Emily had written that last paragraph herself. Patricia read it and said, "This is very good. I spent a long time thinking about what I would have needed someone to say to me 5 years ago to get me talking," Emily said. At 6:40 that evening, Patricia's office received a reply from a personal email address, not the firm's. The name on the account read C. D'Souza. 4 sentences. *I have been waiting for someone to file that motion for 4 years. I can be available tomorrow morning. I will not meet at your office or anywhere connected to either party. I will send a location. Patricia read it aloud. The silence that followed was the silence of a door swinging open. Emily looked across the table at Marcus, and he looked back at her, and what passed between them needed no words. The recognition that something Ethan Walker had built 5 years earlier, in the last months of his life, with full knowledge of what was coming, was finally beginning to work exactly as he'd designed it to. "She's been sitting on this 4 years," Danny said, "waiting for someone else to move first. She needed to know she wasn't going to be the only one standing there when whatever comes next arrives," Emily said. "She's not," Marcus said. He meant it for D'Souza. Emily heard it for herself. The next morning arrived with the particular quiet of a day that already knows something's about to happen inside it. Marcus was up before 5. Nothing unusual there. Hector reached Iron Horse by 5:30. Patricia arrived at 6 with her paralegal, a recorder, and a legal pad ready to be filled. D'Souza's location, a small independent diner in Tempe, no ties to anyone relevant, public enough to feel safe, private enough for a real conversation, had come through the night before at 10:30, neutral ground, clearly chosen by someone who'd spent a long time thinking about what neutral ground would need to look like. Emily came downstairs at 6:15, wearing the same clothes she'd had on for 2 days. Everything else still sat in the bag in her car she hadn't thought to retrieve. She stood in the main bar staring down at herself, an expression almost funny given the stakes. The smallest human problem tucked inside the largest situation she'd ever navigated. Rosa appeared from the kitchen with a folded shirt. "It's clean. Should fit well enough." Emily took it, looked at Rosa a moment. "Go get ready," Rosa said. "No time to be sentimental." Emily almost smiled and headed back upstairs. "She's going to be okay," Hector said quietly to Marcus. "I know," Marcus said. "She was always going to be okay. She just needed to stop being okay alone." Marcus thought about that a moment. That's true of most people. They reached the diner in Tempe at 7:50. Patricia went in first with her paralegal. Marcus and Hector waited outside. The arrangement Emily had insisted on. D'Souza had agreed to speak with Emily and Patricia. Nobody else. Emily had been emphatic. They honor exactly what D'Souza had agreed to. No more, no less. Because a woman who'd carried a secret for 4 years needed proof. The people asking for her trust were exactly as trustworthy as they claimed. Emily went in last. She left the chain in Marcus's truck and walked into the diner carrying nothing but her father's folded letter. Carla D'Souza was already seated in a back booth. Early 40s, dressed with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd prepared meticulously for this meeting, carrying that same tension Marcus recognized in Emily. The pull between fear and resolve, between wanting to run and choosing to stay. She looked up when Emily sat down, studied her a long moment. "You look like him. I only ever saw one photograph in the files, but you look like him." "I've been told that," Emily said. Patricia set her recorder on the table. D'Souza glanced at it, then at Patricia, then reached into her bag and set a thick manila folder between them. "I've had this in my car for 3 years, D'Souza said, "because I didn't know where to bring it, and I was scared to keep it at home." She looked at Emily. Everything Fenn had on the Walker estate, the original documents, the legal pad notes from his client visits, and a memo he wrote to his own file 11 days before he died. Emily looked at the folder, but didn't reach for it. "Why didn't you advance the motion?" D'Souza was quiet a moment. "Because 3 months after I inherited the files, a man came to see me at the office. Calm, very clear. Told me the Walker matter was settled, and that advancing it would create complications that would be harmful to everyone involved." She stopped. He used that word, harmful, in a way that didn't mean professionally harmful. A pause. "I had a 7-year-old daughter. I chose to stay quiet. And then you moved to Whitmore and Associates," Emily said. "I thought if I was inside the firm, I'd understand what I was dealing with. Thought proximity would give me information." D'Souza's hands lay flat on the table. "What it gave me instead was 4 years of knowing exactly how these people operated and being unable to do a thing about it. Because every time I considered moving, I thought about the way that man said, *harmful*. What changed?" "Your letter," D'Souza said simply. "When I saw the motion had been filed, I understood something had shifted, that someone had found the thread and started pulling it." She paused. "And when I saw your name on the filing, I understood exactly who'd pulled it." She looked at Emily, her expression carrying too many things to name cleanly. "He used to talk about you, Fenn, in his notes. Called you his primary reason for making the documentation bulletproof. He wrote in the memo that whatever happened to him, the filing had to be enough to protect the girl." The table went quiet. Emily reached out and rested a hand on the folder without opening it yet. "He was right," she said. "It was enough." D'Souza nodded, pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes, a gesture so small and human in the middle of everything that it carried more weight than any statement she could have made. "Miss D'Souza," Patricia said gently, "I'd like to begin taking your statement whenever you're ready." D'Souza lowered her hand and straightened. "I've been ready for 4 years," she said. "I was just waiting for someone else to go first." Outside, Marcus sat on his tailgate with Hector beside him, thinking about Ethan again, becoming something close to a permanent state. He thought about the memo sitting in that folder, written 11 days before Gerald Fenn died. *Whatever happens to him, the filing has to be enough to protect the girl. To men who never met, working 5 years apart, each of them choosing to build something instead of running from something, each putting his own piece of protection into place and trusting someone would eventually come along to connect them. How long do you think they'll be in there? Hector asked. However long it takes. Hector was quiet a moment. You know Pritchard and Coyle are going to fight this. I know. Going to get loud before it gets quiet. I know that too. And the people inside the county system, deal with them one problem at a time, Marcus said. He looked toward the diner. She's something else. That girl. Marcus thought about the chain looped on the floor of his truck. The scraping sound it had made crossing the Iron Horse floor 2 nights earlier, silencing 300 men who thought they'd heard everything. He thought about what it took to walk alone into a room, that at 20, carrying nothing but a dead man's chain, a letter, and 5 years of refusing to accept that the wrong people get to win. She's exactly what Ethan said she was, Marcus said. The diner door opened. Emily came out first, holding the manila folder. Her face wasn't the face of someone who'd just finished something. It was the face of someone who'd just picked something up. The difference was visible from 20 feet if you knew how to look, and Marcus knew how to look. She crossed to the truck, holding up the folder. Fenn's original notes, D'Souza's full statement on record, and something nobody else knew about, except Fenn. She opened the folder and pulled out a single document. He had a backup attorney, someone he trusted outside Phoenix, mailed copies of everything to this person 2 days before the accident. That attorney's been holding on to them for 5 years, waiting for someone from the estate to make contact. Marcus stared at her. He built a redundancy. Emily confirmed, because he knew his own files might not survive. She handed him the document, a name and an address. An attorney in Tucson who'd sat on copies of the motion, the legal pad notes, the memo, for 5 years, waiting, the way Carl had waited, the way D'Souza, terrified in her own quiet way, had waited. Ethan had known. He'd built protection so layered that 5 years of opposition, silence, intimidation, shell companies, one very convenient accident, hadn't been enough to unravel it. He'd understood his enemy clearly enough to design defenses against every move they made. And then he'd trusted that someday someone would come along and pick up what he'd built. Marcus studied the document, then looked at Emily. Your father, he started, then stopped. Because some things are too large for the sentences meant to carry them. Emily's eyes were clear and full, uncertain. I know, she said. She tucked the paper back into the folder. Get Patricia. We need to call Tucson. Hector was already moving. And Marcus Stone Callahan, 55 years old, 30 years of road behind him, and plenty more still ahead, sat on his tailgate holding proof that a dead man had outmaneuvered people who thought they'd already won, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the moment he'd first read the name Ghost on a vest dragged across his floor. The unsettled thing had been grief. What replaced it felt a great deal like pride. The attorney in Tucson was named Bernard Okafor, and he picked up on the first ring. Patricia made the call from the diner parking lot, while Emily stood 3 feet away, catching the half of the conversation she could hear. Marcus stayed near the truck, giving her the space he'd learned over the last 48 hours she sometimes needed, not because she was pulling away, but because she was concentrating, pulling everything inward to a single point of focus, the way her father used to before he made a decision that mattered. Mr. Okafor, Patricia said. My name is Patricia Solano. I represent the Walker estate in a probate matter filed in Maricopa County. I believe you may be holding documents relevant to that case. A pause. Then Patricia's expression shifted. Nothing dramatic, just a slight change around the eyes. The look of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd believed, but hadn't been certain of until that moment. Yes, we can be there this afternoon. She hung up and turned to Emily, he said. She stopped. Unusual for Patricia, who rarely stopped mid-sentence. He said he'd been waiting for this call for 4 years. Said Gerald Fenn told him, or would come eventually. told him to keep the documents somewhere safe, and when someone finally reached out about the Walker estate, to make sure they were who they claimed before handing anything over. How did he verify us? Emily asked. He asked me to describe the chain. The parking lot went silent. Emily absorbed that with her eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were bright in a way that wasn't tears and wasn't not tears. Something in the space between the two that doesn't have a clean name. Fen knew about the chain, she said. Your father told him. Patricia said quietly. Told him if anyone ever came claiming to represent his daughter's estate, they'd know about the chain. Said it was the one thing nobody could fake. Marcus heard that from where he stood and turned away for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, breathing slowly. The thing that finally cracked through the controlled professional exterior he'd been holding for 2 days. Not the fraud, not the shell companies, not Roy Stoller's name on a police report, not even asterisk, they now asterisk written on a whiteboard. It was the image of Ethan Walker, dying, explaining to his attorney that the one detail that would confirm everything he'd built was a motorcycle chain, because it was the single thing no one else on earth would think to mention. A man running out of time had thought of absolutely everything. They drove to Tucson that afternoon, Patricia and her paralegal in one car, Emily riding with Marcus and Hector. 2 hours on the road, and for most of it nobody spoke, which was the right call. Too much to process for conversation to be worth much. Marcus drove. Emily sat with the manila folder in her lap, Fen's documents inside, and somewhere around the halfway mark she fell asleep, which told Marcus more about the depth of her exhaustion than anything she'd said aloud. She slept with one hand resting on the folder. From the back seat, Hector said quietly, she trusts us. Yeah, Marcus said. She didn't. Walking into nights ago. No, she didn't. Your father would have handled this exactly the way you did, Hector said. The highest praise he was capable of giving, and they both knew it. Marcus said nothing. He kept driving. Emily woke about 20 minutes outside Tucson, blinked, oriented herself, looked down at the folder, then out the window at the desert sliding past. I used to think the hardest part was being alone, she said. With no lead up at all. Marcus glanced over. But it wasn't, she said. The hardest part was knowing my father had prepared everything perfectly and still losing. It felt like preparation didn't matter, like it didn't matter how carefully you did things. And now? Marcus asked. She looked at the folder. Now I think I understand what he was actually doing. He wasn't trying to stop them from taking the business. He couldn't stop that. He knew he was dying. Knew they were organized. Knew a 15-year-old couldn't fight that alone no matter how well he wrote the paperwork. She paused. What he was building was something that would still be waiting when I was finally old enough and strong enough to use it, making sure that when I finally showed up ready to fight, the weapons would already be in place. He trusted you to get there, Marcus said. He trusted me to get there, Emily said. Even when I didn't trust myself. Bernard Okoffer's office occupied the 4th floor of a downtown Tucson building with the worn, settled feel of a place that had done real work a long time. Okoffer himself was tall, late 50s, unhurried in the way of someone who'd learned that the important things rarely benefit from rushing. He shook Patricia's hand first, then Emily's, holding hers a beat longer than a standard handshake, studying her with an expression both careful and kind. You look like the photograph he showed me, he said. He showed you a photograph, brought it to our very first meeting, said it mattered to him that I understood exactly who I was holding these documents for. He released her hand. He told me, she come when she's ready. Don't rush her, and don't doubt her. Something crossed Emily's face that she controlled almost fast enough. They sat at Okoffer's conference table. He opened a fireproof safe behind his desk and drew out a sealed accordion folder. The date of Fen's death written across the seal in marker. I haven't opened this since Gerald sealed it, Okoffer said, setting it down. Those were my instructions. Hold it sealed until someone representing the Walker estate came forward. He looked at Emily. Would you like to do the honors? Emily reached across and broke the seal. Inside sat everything Fen had built. The original trust documents in clean, complete form, the legal pad notes from both shop visits, -17 pages of detailed observations covering every corner of the business structure, the memo to file, written 11 days before the crash, laying out with clinical precision the legal argument that made any debt claim against the restructured entity indefensible. And underneath it all, a single sealed envelope with Emily's name written across it in unfamiliar handwriting. She picked it up, looked at Okafor. Fenn wrote that the day before he died. Okafor said quietly, "Gave it to me along with the folder. Said, if his client's daughter ever opened this safe, she deserved a word from the man who tried to protect her." The room went still. Emily opened the envelope, read it once, silent, then set it face down on the table, both hands flat against the surface, head slightly bowed, for maybe 10 seconds. Nobody spoke. The room had the quality of a space where something sacred was happening, and interrupting felt like a specific kind of wrong. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. "He says he's sorry, he didn't get to finish," she said, voice steady. "Says the filing will hold. Says I should find people I trust and let them help. Because the biggest mistake people make in hard situations is believing they have to carry everything alone." She stopped. "He says my father was the most careful, most loving man he ever worked with in 30 years of practice, and that the work they did together was some of the most important work of his career." Patricia, not a sentimental woman by profession, set down her pen. Okafor sat with his hands folded, silent. Marcus, standing near the door because the room was small, looked at the wall. Emily folded the letter and tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket, beside her father's letter. When she looked back up, her expression had completed some transformation Marcus had watched build for 2 days, from the exhausted, guarded weariness of someone who'd survived alone too long, into something fully, unguardedly present. "Let's finish this," she said. The next 3 weeks were the most intricate, tangled legal and investigative work Marcus had ever stood near, and he'd stood near plenty in 30 years. Patricia filed in Maricopa County and, working with Okafor, filed supporting documentation in Pima County. Reese assembled a complete financial map of Pritchard and Coyle's operation across all 3 states and handed it to a federal contact from his old bank examiner days, someone with the reach and authority to look at what Reese had found and recognize it for exactly what it was. Susie's statement went to that same contact. So did the police report on Gerald Fenn's death, along with a detailed memo Reese had built documenting Roy Stoller's employment history and his specific ties to the investigation that had waved the crash off as ordinary distracted driving. Pritchard and Coyle brought on 3 separate attorneys within the first week of the motion being filed, all from firms with no connection to Whitmore and Associates, meaning they understood exactly how compromised things already were, and were scrambling to build a clean defense far too late. Their opening move was a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds, precisely as Patricia had predicted. Her response was so thoroughly built and so precisely argued that the dismissal was denied within 72 hours, fast enough that everyone involved understood the bench was paying close attention. Their second move was a settlement offer, delivered to Patricia's office in a sealed envelope, carrying a significant number and a 23-page non-disclosure agreement attached. Patricia brought it straight to Emily. Emily read the NDA once, top to bottom, then set it down and looked at Patricia. "If I sign this, what happens to the other families?" "The settlement would apply specifically to the Walker matter," Patricia said carefully. "Other cases wouldn't be affected by your agreement, but my involvement in those cases would be. Yes, this is broad enough to keep you from serving as a witness or offering support in any later action tied to Pritchard and Coyle." Emily looked at the number a long moment. More money than she'd ever seen, more than she'd imagined anyone offering, enough to give back everything that had been stolen, and considerably more besides. Sitting right there, with a pen beside it, she slid it back across the table. "No, Emily, no," she said again, not loudly, not for effect, flat, complete certainty. The certainty of someone who'd already run the calculation before the offer ever arrived. There are 4 other families out there, maybe more. If I take this money and sign that agreement, every single one of them stays exactly where I was 3 weeks ago. No support, no access to anything we've found, no way forward. She held Patricia's eyes. I'm not doing to them what was done to me. Patricia studied her a moment, then said, I'll tell opposing counsel the offer's declined, and picked up her phone. Emily stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. Marcus, watching from the corner chair, thought about what it took for someone who'd been poor and afraid and alone for 5 years to look at that kind of money and simply push it away. Thought about the specific kind of principle required, not performance, not ideology, just the deep, internalized understanding that some things you don't do, no matter what doing them is worth. Your father would have made the same call, Marcus said quietly. She turned from the window. I know, she said. That's how I knew it was the right one. The federal investigation moved faster than most state matters usually do, which suggested whatever Reese had handed his contact carried real weight. Within 2 weeks, Pritchard and Coyle's business accounts were frozen pending investigation. The Shell LLC's purchase of Ethan's building was halted by court order. Whitmore and Associates received a formal inquiry that sent 3 of their senior partners scrambling for personal counsel, the specific legal maneuver that signals people inside a firm have decided the firm's interests and their own are no longer the same thing. Roy Stoller's connection to the Fen investigation was referred to the State Attorney General's office. Carl Briggs, recovering from his broken ribs and broken arm, the way men of his generation are from things, stubbornly, without complaint to anyone who asked, gave a recorded statement from his hospital bed that added, witness intimidation to a case already dense with wrongdoing. The third attorney, Pritchard, had withdrew from the case midway through week 3. That was the moment Marcus understood they'd won, not the legal outcome that was still grinding through multiple courts and jurisdictions and would keep grinding for months. But the essential thing, the thing that actually mattered, was decided the instant their own attorney concluded the situation was too damaged to risk his professional reputation over. Marcus told Emily. She was seated at the table in Iron Horse's back room, which had become their working headquarters over the past 3 weeks. The chain hung on the wall now. Marcus had asked her early in the 2nd week whether she wanted it back, was all right with him hanging it, and she'd looked at it a long moment and said, put it up. He'd hung it himself, on a hook between the window and the memorial board where the chapter kept the names of fallen brothers. It looked exactly right there. Pritchard's attorney withdrew, Marcus told her. Emily looked up from the document she was reviewing, absorbed it, and nodded. How long until the building question's resolved? Patricia thinks the freeze becomes permanent within 60 days. After that, the property reverts to the estate, which means it reverts to you. Emily sat with that a moment. I don't know what to do with the building. Marcus sat across from her. What did your father do with it? Ran a small engine repair shop. Could you do that? I don't know how to fix small engines. Carl Briggs does, Marcus said. And he's going to need something to do once he's out of that hospital. Emily stared at him, and then something happened in her face that hadn't happened in the 2.5 weeks she'd been living and working out of Iron Horse. She laughed, a real one, sudden and genuine and brief. The laugh of someone who's been holding something to type for too long and just felt it given. Inch, you want me to ask a 60-something retired mechanic with a broken arm to go back to work? I want you to consider the possibility, Marcus said, that Carl Briggs has been waiting 5 years for someone to give him a reason to walk back into that building, and the only person who can give him that reason is you. Emily glanced at the chain, then at her father's name carved into the memorial board, carved there 5 years ago by men who'd meant to honor him and had. Marcus now understood, only finished half the job. The name on the building, Emily said slowly. When I first drove up to it, The sign still read Walker's small engine repair. She paused. They changed it eventually. Phoenix Power Equipment. What would you put on the sign? She thought it over. Walker's, she said. Just Walker's. Marcus nodded. That's a good name. The Maricopa County probate matter, formally resolved 51 days later. Patricia called Emily at 7 in the morning with the news, and Emily was already awake. She hadn't been sleeping in late 4 weeks by that point, her internal clock apparently deciding early mornings were the correct time to be alert for whatever the day demanded. Fenn's 5-year-old motion was upheld. The debt claim was ruled invalid against the restructured business entity. The property and all associated business assets were restored to the Walker estate. Pritchard and Coyle, by that point the subjects of a federal investigation that had grown to cover all 3 states and a preliminary count of 9 fraudulent acquisitions, didn't contest the ruling. Patricia also told Emily that 2 of the 4 other families whose businesses had been stolen had already been contacted by federal investigators and were being offered paths toward restitution as part of the broader case. Emily stood in the Iron Horse parking lot, listening to Patricia lay it all out in her precise, organized way. When Patricia finished, Emily said, "Thank you for all of it. Your father was right about you," Patricia said. "You never even met my father." "He consulted me once about his business structure," Patricia said, "and told me that day that the most important thing he was doing wasn't illegal paperwork. He said the most important thing was making sure that when his daughter eventually ran up against something too large for one person to carry alone, she'd understand that asking for help wasn't the same as giving up." She paused. "He appears to have been correct." Emily was quiet a moment. "He was usually correct. The gathering at Iron Horse that weekend wasn't planned as anything formal. Word traveled the way it always traveled through the chapter and beyond it, and people showed up the way they showed up when something mattered. Riders from the Phoenix chapter and the Nevada chapter to chapters out of New Mexico who'd received Reese's documentation and understood exactly what the investigation meant for their own territories. People who'd ridden with Ethan Walker back before he got sick. People who'd never known him personally, but had heard the story of a chain scraping across the floor 3 weeks earlier and understood instinctively what it meant. Carl Briggs came, arm still in its cast, moving carefully but present. Rosa sat him near the bar and kept bringing him food he hadn't asked for, and he ate every bite because refusing Rosa's cooking felt like poor manners. Okifer drove up from Tucson. Even Carla D'Souza came, which surprised Marcus, though perhaps it shouldn't have. She arrived alone, clearly uncertain of her reception, standing in the doorway with the careful posture of someone who understood the room read complicated feelings about her history. She'd held those documents 4 years. She'd also stayed silent 4 years. Emily spotted her in the doorway, crossed the room, and offered her hand. D'Souza shook it. "You came through in the end," Emily said. "I should have come sooner." "Yes," Emily said, "but you came." She brought D'Souza inside, introduced her to Carl, who studied her a long moment before nodding. Carl understood the complicated math of people who'd done imperfect things under frightening circumstances. Introduced her to Patricia, who shook her hand with full professionalism and set the rest aside for the evening. Because the evening wasn't the time for that conversation. Marcus watched all of it from his corner, watched the room fill, watched conversations layer over each other with the specific warmth of a gathering where something real had actually been won. Watched Carl Briggs laugh at something Danny said, a full laugh that clearly hurt his ribs, one he didn't bother suppressing. Watched Patricia accept a beer from someone with the mild surprise of a woman used to accepting beers and deciding this was the occasion to start. And he watched Emily Walker move through the room. She wasn't a different person than the one who dragged a chain across this floor 3 weeks earlier. She was entirely the same person, just without the weight that had been pressing her into a smaller shape. She stood differently, moved differently, talked to people with a directness that had always lived in her, but had previously been pointed inward at whatever problems sat directly in front of her. and was now simply the natural bearing of a person who knew exactly where she stood. At some point Marcus stood, and the room quieted the way it always quieted when he rose. 30 years had taught everyone that when Marcus Stone Callahan got to his feet at Iron Horse, it was worth listening to. He looked around the room, looked at the chain on the wall. 5 years ago, he said, we buried a brother. We did the things you do. Showed up at the cemetery, said his name, put it on the wall. He paused. And we thought that was enough. What we've learned, he went on, is that honoring someone isn't a single act. It isn't the funeral, the name on the wall, the memorial ride. Honoring someone is what you do for the people they loved, and the things they built and the promises they made. After the ceremony's over, after the road goes quiet, when it'd be easy to assume the obligation's finished. He looked at Emily. She looked back. 3 weeks ago, a young woman walked into this bar carrying her father's chain because every other door in her life had shut. She'd spent 5 years doing exactly what her father told her to do, trying every road available, fighting with everything she had, coming here only when there was truly nothing left. And what she found when she got here was that her father had already left something waiting for her. He paused. Not us, he said. We weren't what he left. What he left was a set of tools, a letter, a chain, a motion sitting in a courthouse, a sealed folder in an attorney's safe in Tucson, instructions precise enough to walk a 20-year-old woman through a fight that had already beaten grown men with money and legal training. He looked at the chain. Ethan Ghost Walker spent the last 4 months of his life building something meant to outlast him. Not a business, not a name on a wall. He looked back at Emily. He built his daughter a way home. The room held that. Carl put his good hand over his eyes for a moment. She found her way, Marcus said, and brought back enough to help 4 other families find theirs too. And she turned down more money than most people could imagine because she decided her father's name meant something specific, and she wasn't going to let it mean anything less. He lifted his glass to Ghost and to the daughter, who made sure he won. 300 voices answered back. Emily didn't say it with them. She stood with her glass raised, staring at the chain on the wall, lips moving faintly in the way lips move when someone's saying something private that isn't meant to be overheard. Marcus heard it anyway. Standing close, the room briefly quiet between the toast and the answering roar. Asterisk, I got here. Dad, I got here. Asterisk. After the crowd thinned and the bikes rolled out one by one into the Arizona night, Emily sat with Marcus and Carl at the corner table. Carl's cast arm rested on the wood. A cup of coffee Rosa had brought and asked steaming beside it. Emily had her father's letter open in front of her, reading it for probably the 100th time since she'd first unfolded it 4 months earlier. You fixing up the building? Carl asked. Working on it. You're going to need a mechanic. Emily looked at him. Your arm's broken. Broken for maybe 4 more weeks, Carl said. The building question's going to take longer than 4 weeks to sort out. Emily glanced at Marcus, who shrugged. The shrug of a man who'd already made his suggestion and was content to let it play out on its own schedule. I don't know how to run a business, Emily said. Your father didn't either when he started, Carl said. He figured it out. He had more time than I do. You've got more help than he ever did, Carl said simply. The simplicity of it landed the way true. Simple things land. Emily looked up at the chain on the wall. She'd been returning to it all evening, the way you return to something that's been the center of gravity in your life a long time, and is slowly becoming something else, not less important, just differently important. A compass matters less once you've found your direction and started walking. She was quiet a moment. He wrote in the letter that once I found the people he sent me to find, I'd understand why he trusted them. Marcus looked at her. I understand, she said. Carl reached across with his good hand and covered hers, the same way he had at the hospital, the gesture of a man who'd known her father and understood some things just couldn't be said any other way. Emily turned her hand over and held on. Outside, the last few bikes pulled out, their engines carried out into the desert night, into the darkness and the long flat roads that connected every corner of this life to every other corner of it. Marcus looked at the chain. He thought about the night it scraped across his floor and silenced 300 men. He thought about Ethan Walker, who'd spent his last 4 months building instead of grieving, who'd trusted his daughter to survive 5 years completely alone because he knew what she had in her, and trusted the people he'd chosen to be waiting when she finally arrived. He thought about the families with a path forward now, about Carl, who'd be back in that building in 5 weeks with his cast off and his tools out, rebuilding something that never should have been taken from him in the first place, about Patricia, who'd never admit how much this case had gotten to her, but whose phone calls had grown longer and less formal with every week that passed, about 2 words on a whiteboard, asterisk, they know asterisk, and what Ethan had chosen to do with that knowledge in the days and weeks that followed, which direction he'd chosen to face, not away, toward, always toward. He looked at Emily Walker, 20 years old, sitting at the corner table of Iron Horse Tavern with Carl Briggs's hand in hers, her father's letter folded in her jacket, and the whole complicated, hard-won rest of her life stretched out ahead of her. He looked at her and saw Ethan in the line of her jaw, in the directness of her eyes, in that particular stillness that looked like calm even when it was the furthest thing from it, and he understood, with the full, settled clarity of a man who'd spent 30 years learning the difference between what matters and what only seems to, that Ethan Ghost Walker hadn't failed his daughter. He'd given her everything, the tools, the protection, the people, the proof, and the patience, and he'd trusted her, completely, to know exactly what to do with all of it when the moment finally came. She'd walked through the door of Iron Horse Tavern dragging a chain across the floor, alone, exhausted, carrying 5 years of refusing to quit. She'd walked in alone, and she would never walk alone again.